Hello everyone and welcome to the 8th and final seminar in this term series on organic archaeology's wetland futures. And it is my enormous privilege to introduce to you our speaker for today, who will no doubt be familiar to many of you, Professor Nicki Whitehouse from the University of Glasgow, where Nicki is currently Professor of Archaeological Science, I believe. Without further ado, I'll go straight in and let Nicki present to you some fantastic research coming out of the Humberhead Levels and also hopefully a newer project as well.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you very much for all of you for coming along today. So I'm delighted to be able to tell you a little bit about this research project. I should say from the outset, this is a really personal project to me. I've been working in this area since I was a master's student, which was about 1993. And it's a place I keep on coming back to over and over again. And sometimes I wonder why I'm doing that. I've sort of got rather obsessed with it. But each time I go back into it, I find a new facet, which really kind of takes me into another dimension, I suppose. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this project called Reconstructing the Wildscapes, and along the way I'm also going to allude to another project which has just recently started. I have a lot of collaborators and co-authors, some of whom I know are also equally passionate about this place. So I hope I will be able to represent well some of their ideas as well as some of mine as we've developed the project. So this particular project has been running for quite a long time. I'm currently writing up a lot of material, writing a monograph on this work. It was a Heritage Lottery funded project, and the work was really designed to try to collate and pull together a lot of existing data from this region, from archaeology, palaeoenvironmental studies, and also geoarchaeology. And I suppose what we were really interested in thinking about, why does the landscape look as it does today? How has it been transformed by human-environment interactions? And I was also really interested in this idea of looking at wetland landscapes as a continuum. I suppose for a lot of my previous research, I'd really focused particularly on the raised bog systems, but I became increasingly interested in understanding how those systems interdigitated with the wider landscapes. And so really trying to think about those relationships, and also thinking about what the implications of a lot of that work is and may be. And I will sort of talk a little bit about that as I go through. These are some of the project team members, so particularly Ben Geary, who I think you hosted a few weeks ago, also Henry Chapman, Michelle Farrell, Jane Bunting, Kim Davies, Nika Shillabod, and Vilma, can't remember his second name, and then one of our master's students. So we've had a lot of people working on this project. And the project was really designed to start to sort of synthesize and collate a lot of data. These dots on the map, these are all archaeological find spots, and then these are geoarchaeological data sets, and we had a lot of LiDAR data as well. There's something like 22,500 georeference find spots. It's a huge, massive data set. And I think we've been able to sort of look at these in quite a holistic way. I suppose what at the heart of what we were trying to do here was really to try to understand how these rich wetland environments really developed. Alongside, there weren't just bogs, there were also rivers, there was meres, and I'll talk a little bit about those, and how they sort of shaped the relationship of people and place. Because these wetland landscapes, they're not accessible through foot, that you have to move around through the waterways. And I think you have to think about these places in quite different ways to the way in which many today think about these landscapes. But they're also areas of deep social and economic deprivation. The areas that we're looking at are not really close to any universities. These are images from Thorn, that's Thorn Pit Colliery. A lot of them are ex-mining communities. And as I think I will start to sort of talk about, I think there's been a real disconnection between a lot of the communities who live in this landscape and what's happened in these landscapes that I think really deserves to be told in a much broader setting. I also think this is a very colonial landscape, and I'll explain why in a minute. So to me, there were lots of things that we wanted to try and pull together. The other project I will briefly allude to, we've only just started this project, but I'll mention this as we progress. This is the Respect project we've just started. This is a land use for net zero project. And I'm one of the co-investigators, and luckily we've decided to use the Humberhead Levels as one of the case study areas. That's not the only area, but we realised through the Wildscapes project that there was a lot of information that we were generating that had relevance to land use decision making, and I'll sort of elaborate as I progress on where I think some of those inputs are. This project is one of the 5 projects which has been funded, and they will all be feeding into the UK's land use decision making frameworks, and it's the only one with any archaeology associated with it. And I think it's quite pressing in that context because, of course, land use has a massive impact on the archaeological record. So I imagine some of you know about Cornelis Vermuyden, since he also created or drained the fens here. Cornelis Vermuyden actually started off in the Humberhead Levels, and he came in and drained this whole landscape. And I think it's no accident that the drainage of the Humberhead Levels was instigated by Charles I, who was one of the last sort of monarchs who took a very extreme view about sort of monastic kingship and the rights of the monarch. And so when he instigated the drainage of the levels, he was clearly practicing his divine right as a monarch to convert these last portions of what he perceived as being wildernesses. But in doing so, he set in motion a whole set of chains and other things that sort of happened. So today, the landscape, so this is a map that shows the old pre-drainage landscape. This is what is known as a traditional map. It was quite often seen as being largely a figuration of what actually happened, but we've been able to track a lot of these river systems through LiDAR, so it's actually not a bad representation. I suppose the most important things to point out is that when Vermuyden came in, he removed all of this river here and all of that. They did a massive engineering job. So the old River Don was all removed, and all the meres were all removed. The idle up from here, the Torn, this was sort of canalised and went off in that direction. So you can see that the Don essentially just then was diverted up in this direction. All of these rivers disappeared, they put more drains in, and then diverted the idle into the Trent. And in doing so, they completely and utterly transformed this landscape. And the consequences of that sort of really were felt for long periods of time, and I would say arguably to today. So here is the sort of close-up of the same map. The things to perhaps draw attention to are these meres, which we've been trying to track down in the LiDAR and in the landscape palaeoenvironmental records, and that mere as well. You can spend a lot of time looking at these maps. I discovered that there are all sorts of things on them when you look at them really carefully. There's like windmills everywhere and things like that. So you can spend lots of time trying to decipher things. This is what the landscape looks like today. It's flat, it's featureless. It looks very much like outside Cambridge, really. High agricultural activities, largely, growing crops, etc. And you can see alongside this sort of aerial image some of these sort of long cables that you get. These long cables that you get. These are all sort of reclaimed land. This is along the Trent, actually. So they did a massive reclamation job. This is from the Isle of Axholme, from Grindley on the Hill. It's about the only elevated area across the whole landscape. The rest of it's just very, very flat. And largely all sort of fields like this. So you wouldn't know anything about this landscape history if you didn't delve into the archaeology and the historical record. Today, the remaining areas of bog have been worked out very extensively. This is part of my PhD work. I spent a lot of time on both Thorn Hatfield moors, and in those days it was still being milled very extensively, and the bogs were really completely and utterly decimated, and then left to natural England to regenerate. I mean, I'm not sure they're really regenerating, but they are certainly revegetating. But Vermuyden really struggled actually with the bogs, even into they continued to drain in the 18th and 19th century and 20th century. So although he was successful with the rivers, he sort of struggled, I think, with some of the raised bog systems. And they were constantly making little repairs and trying to alleviate the system. So, for example, here, even as late in the sort of 19th century, talks about Thorn Moor still being a shaking bog, which trembled in waves. That kind of indicates that the acrotelm is still fairly intact. And they describe the sort of dome of Thorn Moors going up and down seasonally above the surrounding plains. So quite clearly it was still functioning rather well at that time. And then Hatfield Moors, which is sort of to the south of Thorn Moors, this has a much more drier feeling to it, but it has a sort of wilderness-like aspect to it. This is actually written by Peter Skidmore in the 90s, but he was referring to the 1960s. And very nicely, when you go out onto Hatfield, and this is a picture of Hatfield now, it's starting to restore itself, actually. It's a really interesting landscape to visit, and it does have this sort of it does have a wilderness sense to it. And I think if you have an opportunity to go to either of these two sites, I would definitely encourage you to do so. They are massive sites. A lot of people don't go and visit them because, strangely enough, or perhaps not so strangely, many people are kind of scared to go onto these landscapes. They're seen as being, I suppose, unknowns, but they are massive sites and they really are well worth sort of visiting. But they provide sort of vestiges, I suppose, of what this landscape might have looked like. Before drainage, of course, completely different story. This is known as the Inklesmore map, and it's one of the earliest coloured maps in England, and it shows the area of Inklesmore, which we have identified as probably representing the areas of Thorn Hatfield Moors. We're not quite sure exactly which areas. This particular map was developed because there was a land contention between, I think it was the Duke of Lancaster and a monastic house in the Vale of York. They were arguing about Tilbury rights. But it gives you a sense of what the area looked like before drainage. And the first thing to notice, of course, is that there are quite a lot of drainage systems within that, going all around the moor itself, coming off with these dikes, and they're clearly already taking off peat of these areas. These are some of the meres. I think that's Bradholme Mere. But the interior, of course, still looks sort of fairly intact and wilderness-like. Robert van der Noort and forget who else. There was a paper by Robert van der Noort and a colleague who talk a little bit about this figure, and they make the point that what's interesting is that there are quite a lot of churches shown on some of these are little villages and towns. There's churches. There's sort of quite a lot of religious sort of aspects to this figure. And they make the point that this is part of a movement towards the Christianisation of the landscape, and the drainage of these places is part of that sort of movement towards, I suppose, the domestication of the wild. And you can certainly see that as you're going through these parcels of land. They're clearly being cut over, and then what's left over is what's in the middle. So it's fairly clear from this alone that drainage was already happening in these landscapes well before Vermuyden. And I think, as I will talk a little bit later on, what's becoming very evident is actually Vermuyden, I think, made use of a lot of existing drainage patterns. He consolidated a lot of drainage activity that was already happening. And I suspect some of this is dating back to the Roman period at least, and then the medieval, and then the post-medieval period. This is another an image actually which Mel Giles lent me, which is from another bog. This is Wyatt Moss, And I was sort of quite struck by the similarities between these. And the thing that she sort of highlights are these pits here, these hellholes, which I think are really interesting. And there's actually a farmstead on the other side of Thornmoors called Hades Farm, which I find fascinating. But there is this comparison between peatlands and the other world, the underworld. And there are lots of archaeological sort of narratives and discussions around the relationship between peatlands and votive objects, bog bodies, all of that. And it's quite interesting to see aspects of that sort of other world component coming in some of these maps. These are some quotes from John Leyland, who visited this landscape in the sort of during Henry VIII's period. And he talks about this sort of moving across this landscape. He has to move in a boat, for starters. You can't go on horseback. And a local historian, Colin Howes, he talks about this. Leyland really provides a window into what must have been a truly Everglade-like landscape. And I always think that's such a fascinating statement, because the notion that in England we had an Everglade-like landscape seems anomalous, but I think it's a really nice comparison of what these places might have looked like. So he talks about, the quarters of Hatfield. We've got woods, it's got lots of red deer, it's got all these fens and moors, and talks about going across Thorn Mere, moors and fens, and then going across all this, almost a mile over on this mere. We've actually worked out where we think John Leyland went along in his boat, and we found new paleochannels that are not really been mapped previously that we think he followed. But this just gives you a real sense of what this landscape looked like. The other thing I want to touch upon is how a lot of this drainage history occurred, and I suppose the consequence of this. And I think what is very clear when you look at the historic record is that people who lived in these places pursued quite traditional practices. They had particular ways of living in these landscapes, using fishing, fowling, turbary rights. Here we've got leech gatherers. But in that process, a lot of historians, particularly in the sort of 17th, 18th, 19th century, spent quite a long time in denigrating and dehumanising people who lived in these landscapes. So there's quite a nice quote here by Byford, who was a historian, and he makes this comment that the fens of Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire were seen by outsiders as waste and unprofitable, with a backward populace. The fen people's economic organisation was incomprehensible to outsiders, who considered the population to be subhuman. Only by drainage, outsiders believed, which would get rid of the fenlands, would produce a land that was profitable. The fen people considered their habitat quite differently, because it offered abundant grazing with small areas of fertile arable land. They could supplement their income by fishing and fowling, as well as being able to gather reeds for fuel and thatching. Any proposals to drain the fens met with strong opposition. And I'm guessing you're probably quite familiar with this from the fens as well, but you see exactly the same thing happening in the Humber Levels. But you also see this sort of denigration, dehumanisation. And here's another quote. This is actually again from Mel. This is from Lindale Moss, which is even more extreme. They are of a very ancient race, totally different from surrounding people. They have a long head, projecting eyebrows, high cheekbones, strong and coarse limb, laden aspect, slow motion. I mean, the whole thing is designed to denigrate and put these people down. And it was very much part of this pattern of behaviour, which is to sort of bring these areas into productive life, and to sort of domesticate the people who occupied these landscapes. So the drainage isn't just about the domestication of land, but it's also about domestication of people. And it's also about appropriation of people and appropriation of people's way of life. And I think that's something I want to sort of stress. And so this kind of led to a whole set of other consequences that I think are still being played out today. And to give you an example of that, when the land was taken over by the Crown, it was divided up into three. So Charles I took a third. The participants who paid for the drainage with Charles I took another third. So they took the best bits of land. And then all the bits which were not drained, they gave to the commoners. And the consequence of that is that the commoners lost huge amounts of land. They lost a lot of productive land. But the descendants of the participants are essentially the modern farming communities today. And they make huge amounts of money off this landscape. And a lot of the commoners essentially are the descendants of the commoners are now the inhabitants of the places like Thorn. So there's a real social justice issue here, I think. And I think the drainage actually bakes in a lot of this kind of problem. They also had a long history of resistance. I mean, they resisted drainage. They resisted during the Civil War. They resisted in the 18th, 19th century, and they continue to resist. The sites of Thorn Hatfield Mills, the only reason they survive is because the local people resisted against those sites becoming essentially big landfill sites, and they really fought against that. And it's also no accident that the Isle of Axholme is one of the last remaining areas where you continue to have strip cultivation. You can see examples of strip cultivation. Now, it's still happening today, but people really fought against it because strip cultivation was one mechanism by which farmers could feed their families on fairly small plots of land. So enclosure was really beneficial to large landowners, but it was not beneficial to many of the smallholders, and that's what they really fought against. And I think, so there's this history of conflict and resistance. And then, of course, as I've already mentioned, there is this transformation of the wetland landscape, which has been construed as progress. But I guess my question is, progress for whom? Is it for one part of society versus another? And it's this sort of this notion of civilization versus primitive that you start to see playing out in these places. And there was a massive loss of ways of living in these landscapes. Loss of common land, grazing, fishing, fowling, and all of those areas were sort of were attached to particular type of activities that people were specialised in. And I think this already baked in a lot of social and economic deprivation in these areas. And I think that's one of the reasons why this kind of research is really important, because it's about thinking about the legacy. And I would say that there is, it's a legacy of empire, actually. And I think it's a story that we should be telling a lot more about. There's this wonderful book, I don't know if anybody's read this, called Imperial Mud, and I think it really captures this idea. And I think, especially within the archaeological realm, I'm sort of conscious that we talk a lot about decolonialisation in the context of other countries, but I'm not sure we seriously talk about decolonialisation in the context of what's happened in our own backyards. And I'm not sure we tell the stories of what's happened here, and I do think they are important stories. 25% of this country was wetland. But we don't tell our stories from a wetland perspective. We tend to tell our stories from a dryland perspective. If you think about, British prehistory, we tend to focus on the dry stuff. We tend to focus on agriculture and all the things that we value today. And I'm trying to sort of make a plea that we need to kind of rebalance that narrative. And these stories deserve to be told. And I think they've largely been forgotten about. I just wanted to show a few pictures, these wonderful images. These are actually from the Norfolk Broads. A colleague of mine introduced them to me. They're some of the earliest landscape photographs. These are from 1885-86, and I think they really capture so beautifully the ways of living in these landscapes, and you just don't see anything like this anymore. So here we've got thatching being sort of cut. Here's another example of this. This is just a completely different environment. And when my colleague introduced me to these images, there's a whole booklet of them. I was completely blown away by these incredible images. And then these sort of thatched structures, and I think this is the last one I'm going to show, but there are a couple of images where you just see people living on these slight islands that you get in these wetland areas, just slightly elevated above the peat or above the clay silts. And this is where people are occupying the landscape. So I've kind of given you a fairly broad and sort of deep introduction to the drainage of the levels, because I felt it was important to sort of highlight some of these issues, and I'll come back to them. But I now want to move on and talk a little bit more about some of the research that we did on the Wildscapes project. So we used a whole range of methods. We did a lot of work around documents, around maps. We used archaeological data. We used a lot of pollen data, particularly using pollen modelling approaches. We also did a lot of use a LiDAR, and we used geoarchaeology. And we're using similar approaches actually in the New Respect project. We also engaged very heavily with local volunteers, and I was amazed at how enthusiastic local people were to come out with us. I mean, it's fairly well known, archaeologists, members of the public love coming out onto archaeological sites and excavating, but I thought nobody's going to be bothered about doing a bit of coring, but they loved it. And they got so much out of it, and there's so much excitement when you put that corer down and you bring up a leaf 4,000 years old, and it's sort of mind-blowing. So we worked a lot with local volunteers. This was an HLF funded project, so that was one of the requirements. And for some of them it was transformative. We had several people out there who've progressed and gone on to do archaeology degrees. There's one student who went on to York, and in fact she's been helping us on Arran on another peat project. There was another student who went on and did a master's. This guy here, he's finished his PhD actually. I think he's doing a postdoctoral project. So one of the things we did was we went and ground truthed a lot of the LiDAR data. So when you look at the LiDAR data, you can see very, very extensive areas of deeper peats. So you can see them here. This is the old Don. This is Thorn Moors, this is Hatfield Moors, but you've got areas of deep peat. This is the Idle Valley, this is the Torn, this is the Don. But we had to spend quite a long time trying to work out the fluvial history of these systems. We also picked up on all these dendritic channels, which I'd never seen before. And I think initially I thought these was related to drainage, but I think subsequently we think they're probably tidal actually, I suspect. But we also started to pick up on all sorts of other channels, such as this is the Old Briar, this is actually the route that Leyland took. And we're still trying to work out, I think we've made reasonable progress, on the dating of these different channels. So this seems to be the pre-Vermoiden channel. This is probably the early Holocene channel. So we're trying to work out the sequence of the different channels. So we've done a lot of coring, we've been ground truthing them. And this is when we realised that there was huge carbon potential in these areas. I mean, some of the peats in these areas go down 5, 6, 7, 8 metres, really extensive areas. And when we started looking in the literature, we realised there was very little known about these buried peats. But also they are starting to release carbon because on the top of the peats there are these warp layers. They're only about between 1 metre and 50 centimetres, and every time the farmers are tilling the land, the peat is starting to be exposed, and there's a lot of concern about carbon loss. And I was contacted by Natural England about a couple of years ago about this because they were looking to make this area one of their key areas for restoration outside of peatlands. And the first thing they said to me was, we want to take the warp off so we can allow the restoration of the bog. And I said, no, don't do that, because you've got all this carbon buried underneath. You mustn't do that. So I started to then talk to sort of carbon modelers about the importance of these buried peats, and that's one of the things we're focusing on in the Respect project. So we spent quite a long time trying to work out the age of the different channels, and here are sort of some close-ups. So we've managed to identify some of the meres that I talked about. We've got several meres up here. I'll mention those again in a minute. But we also think, so these are really complicated structures here, trying to work out what's going on. I think here what's happening is in the Roman or medieval period, they're probably diverting some of the channels. And I think here, for example, there's a Roman channel linking here. There's also a dike that goes across here, and we think that's probably either medieval or Roman. Across these areas here, the peats are not terribly deep actually, but these areas historically we know were very, very wet. In fact, in order to get across to the Isle of Axholme, which is the only elevated area, you needed to get in a boat. They had ferries across from here to here and ferries from here to the other side of the Trent. So in prehistory, this whole area would have been completely surrounded by water. It would have been possible to access it. So I think probably what we've got is something a little bit like this, actually. And I think by doing the fieldwork we've been doing, we've realised that the hydrology and the river systems in this area are much more complicated than we had ever realised. I mean, we just thought there was a couple of rivers, but we're now uncovering all these other channels, some of which are active at some points, not at others. Trying to date them is actually quite a challenge. A lot of this, of course, is being controlled by sea level. So, sea levels have been increasing in the Humber estuary, and they control a lot of these rivers. The Trent, for example, is tidal until Gainsborough, unless it's controlled. So tidal regimes are clearly having a big impact, but they're also draining large areas of the Pennines, big cities. So there's a lot of water flowing across these landscapes. So we've been trying to work out what the landscape history looks like. These are some of the meres. They're quite difficult to disentangle because they've been drained quite a lot. But we think, so this is the pre-Vermeulen channel, and it goes across here and links up with the Idle. We think that is artificial. That is another channel, but I'm beginning to think that was diverted maybe in the medieval or Roman period. And it goes around these meres. So there's one mere, there's another mere in here, something in there, not sure about there. So actually trying to work out what's going on is actually really difficult in these landscapes, especially since there's been so much drainage. And then you've got another channel, you've got another channel coming up here, through here, the Briar. So, once you start looking, you find it's a real network all across the landscape. It's completely different to how this landscape looks today. This is the channel that I just showed you. And I think what's happening here, this has been canalised, almost certainly. This bit here, this is sort of avoiding various things. That is the pre-Vermeulen channel, so it has to be either medieval or Roman. And I think there's a good chance some of it could be Roman, actually, because to maintain navigation, you actually need to deepen those channels. And in the next image, you can see how quite distinct that channel is. So that's the old River Don. We also used cartography to try and work out what was going on. So these meres actually were very productive. We've got lots of historical records about fish and eels being produced in large quantities. I think this is one of the reasons why the monastic houses were so interested in this area. So this is Thorn Mere here. It doesn't have the other meres that I've shown you, which is one of the problems that we have. We often have these meres move around the landscape a little bit. So I think the next image shows that quite well. So we've got this cartographic evidence for Thorn Mere, and it seems to move its position in different time periods. There's another one here, and there's another one here, but I think that's probably misplaced altogether. So we started to wonder, why are these meres changing their shapes? Why are they sort of not always present, some popping up, some not popping up? And I think partly it's to do with drainage, as the landscape's being drained. But I also suspect these meres are maybe they are at least partly artificially looked after because they're important for fishing in particular. You also see the same things turning up in the maps associated with drainage. So there's a mere there, I think there's another one there, and maybe one there. So it's actually quite difficult to disentangle this, actually, because these areas have been drained very extensively. The other thing we've been doing quite a lot of work on has been around using pollen data. So this is work that particularly Michelle Farrell, Kim Davis and Jane Bunting have been leading on. So we've looked at all the pollen data from the area, of which is an extensive data set, and use the multiple scenarios approach to reconstruct land cover. So this uses a modelling approach. Essentially, it reconstructs, it makes use of a existing GIS base model associated with the landscape. So it can either be quaternary geology or it could be hard rock geology, and then it has a set of rules associated with it in terms of the placement of vegetation. And then essentially what it does is it runs thousands and thousands of iterations until it finds a reasonable match for the actual pollen data. So the model itself is not being driven by the pollen, it is being driven independently, but then it compares with the actual pollen data, which is why it's called the multiple scenarios approach, and you give a value, a best fit value to it. But the really the reason we use this approach was that it allows us to start to plot up at a landscape scale the placement of vegetation. So typically pollen records will be from a single location. You can make inferences about where that pollen has come from, but you could have a situation of equifinality. So you might have, for example, lots of heather, but you might not know exactly where that heather's coming from. So the multiple scenarios approach allows you to essentially try to work out what kind of parcels of vegetation you might have had across the landscape, across different community groups. So this is the late Mesolithic MSA reconstruction. So it has the existing paleogeography. The paleogeography is not perfect, actually. I think we want to redo it because when we originally did this work, we hadn't done all the LiDAR and the geoarchaeology work that we've now done. But we'll probably do that at a later stage. But it shows you essentially the natural vegetation as it was in the Mesolithic and the different communities. So you've got wet woodland and oak-dominated woodland within the levels, and then in slightly higher ground you've got lime ash and oak woodland developed. And then there's a Neolithic MSA, which essentially shows similar patterns, but as the bog and the wetlands start to develop, you get more extensive areas of wetlands sort of building up, and you can see them up here. The really nice thing about this approach is it gives you quantified land cover data, and the advantage of that is that you can actually make use of that with other data sets, for example, hydrological data sets. And that's basically what one of the people on this project has done on another project. They've been working with hydrologists, but we're also using this approach with the Respect project in two ways. The first one is to open up people's ideas and minds about how you could use this land. It's not intended to recreate the past, but it is about giving people different options. It's about saying, well, these kind of vegetation systems worked well under these particular climate scenarios. These are possible opportunities. And as that work progresses, we would like to link these past land cover data sets and project them into the future. We haven't done that bit yet, so I'm not quite sure how that's going to work. But I think it's a nice example of where you can use archaeological and paleoenvironmental data to help inform future scenario planning. I'm now going to sort of touch a little bit upon the archaeology. So this is the Mesolithic site distribution data. And the thing that's quite evident, so this is obviously largely lithic distributions. And what you see is that most of the sites are found along the river systems. And Tim Cockrell did quite a lot of lithic analysis work looking at the different assemblages. And he suggests that some of the assemblages are associated with occupation sites, but they're clearly along the river valleys and the Sande Laves, and you can see this quite nicely all along the Idle here, for example. They're making use of these river systems, and it's clearly not so wet that people aren't able to use these areas. You get a mixture of flint sources, but from both the east and the west, so you get from Lincolnshire and the Pennines, suggesting movement across these zones. So people are moving flint sources both east and west. And I suppose the very obvious route to do so is by using the rivers. So they must be using the navigation systems, I think, to transport and to move things around. The thing I want to sort of draw your attention to, there's quite an interesting site down here called Misserton Carr, and this seems to be important right the way through the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, into the Bronze Age. So it's clearly quite an important sort of hub. This is the Neolithic. It's quite similar to what's going on in the previous time window. I suppose the main difference here is that you're starting to see a little bit of palidification impacting some of the river systems. So we now know that peat start in the fluvial systems. They don't start in the raised bogs. The raised bogs develop later on. So the earliest dates we've actually got are in these areas here, which are about 9,000 years ago. So peat is already infilling some of those rivers. And you get the same thing in the Don Valley. And the dates here are within a few centuries of when peat starts to develop on Hatfield Moors. So I think the whole thing is interconnected, and the hydrological system and the rivers in particular are playing a major part in the whole wetland evolution of the landscape. So the only major difference between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic is that you're starting to see more usage of slightly more elevated areas. You're getting the construction of things like trackways. So this is the Hatfield Neolithic trackway, which is constructed very much in response to increasing water levels. And then you continue to see this usage of the rivers. The other thing you also get is you get loads of Neolithic stone axes from areas which you wouldn't necessarily expect. Group 6, Group 1, those are Cornish. I think Group 6 is Welsh. You also get some Langdale stuff. And I find that quite interesting because you're thinking, why is this stuff here? And I would probably hazard a guess that they're using the rivers to move some of this stuff around. And I'll show you an example of why I think this in a minute. So there's a lot happening here. At the same time, when you compare, this is the Isle of Axholme during the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, well, the site occupation is very similar. They're not particularly using new sites. Yes, there are a few more sites in the Neolithic, but in a way, this data set doesn't really kind of support any grand agricultural revolution here in the transition between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic. The sense here is actually continuity. And yes, they're starting to use slightly more elevated areas. They're not, these floodplain areas are starting to be abandoned. There's many less lithics in these sort of floodplain areas, presumably as the landscape gets increasingly wetter. But aside from that, it's much the same as before. Yes, I was going to mention the jadotite axe. So there's a really nice jadotite axe that's been found on the Isle of Rute just there, which, as you probably know, comes from Italy. And then there's a whole set of other axes which were probably deposited within the adjacent areas of wetland. So I do think that these areas are being used either to move things, but also for things to be deposited. Obviously not for this time period, but for later time periods, this area has the largest number of paper bog body records of the whole of the UK. So there's a lot of activity going on in terms of the wetlands and deposition of materials. These are the Bronze Age and Iron Age MSAs, and they actually mimic really nicely. So the brown is peat development. So they show the peat development really, really well. So these are completely driven by models, which are then compared with the actual data sets. So you're starting to see how this landscape is evolving over time and becoming increasingly wetter. If we look at the Bronze Age archaeology, you've got much continuity with the previous period, but increasing focus towards these islands, particularly the Isle of Axholme here, Kroll, and then all of these areas are slightly more elevated as well, and then Rute and within here there are slight patches of sandy areas, but the rivers are still very much the focus. And then you get sort of this quite important distinctive concentration of elaborate objects, metalworks, hoards, across these areas of fen and raise-mire, and often at these sort of intersections. And some of these locations remain important over time. I mentioned Misselton being one of them. So, yeah, they're kind of busy landscapes. There's lots of things happening here. But at the same time, I think what's happening here is slightly different to what we're seeing in the more dryland areas. Iron Age becomes rather quiet, but I suspect that's the case in many other locations. In part, I think the Iron Age is also... So you see a lot of Iron Age Roman sites along the edges. These are actually field systems which have been logged from aerial photography. But within the levels themselves, there's not a huge amount being recovered, presumably in part because it's too wet and probably visibility is a problem. And then this is the Roman period. And I think the Roman period is quite interesting because, so you've got all these Roman sites around the adjacent areas. So this is Doncaster. And then you get these fortlets right in the middle of the peat and the boglands. You've got Fortlet here, a place called Sandtoft, which is at the confluence of the River Idle and the Don. And it took me a long time to think, why is there a fortlet in the middle there? But I can only conclude that it's to do with control of the rivers. And you've also got, this is Crowle, and because you've got all these Roman sites along these rivers, and the fact is that a lot of these rivers have been infilling, I can only assume that they're starting to use these for navigation and they're having to manipulate them, clean them. And this is also when I think the first time we're getting some of these channels being perhaps deepened or new channels put in. I think that one in particular is a new one that goes in the Roman period. So you could say that you're starting to see the taming of this landscape during the Roman and post-Roman, but also you get lots of retting pits, flax and hemp retting pits, and a lot of them have been dated to the medieval period. And I was quite surprised to learn recently that many of them actually go back to the Roman period. So you almost get these sort of quasi-industrial landscapes in the really, really wet areas, such as in these areas here in particular. You can't really use them for much else. And then you get sort of quite unusual artefacts coming out. This Roman copper alloy decorated bowl from Crowle, which I think originates from Pontefract. I suspect, and we know from the archaeological record, that the Romans were transporting things up the Vale of York, for example, to York, and I suspect this is part of something quite similar. This is just trying to summarise our understanding of the rivers at this time period. It's taken quite a long time to work out the sequence of what the rivers might be doing. This is one of the earliest example of a bog body was found is a Roman period bog body. It's the Amcuts woman. Mel Giles wrote about this bog body quite recently because she found new illustrations in the Society of Antiquaries. And she was a bog body found actually next to the Trent in peats. And it took me quite a long time to think about this because I was thinking, well, why would you be peat cutting in old paleochannel deposits of the Trent? Actually, we started to look at old maps and we found new areas of peatland which have been completely worked out, called Lincolnshire Moors, on old manorial maps. So I suspect that's where she came from rather than a paleochannel. But these are, they completely disappeared from the landscape because of peat cutting. So I don't think I don't have any pictures of the footwear. But the two shoes actually are at the Spalding's Gentlemen's Society, if you would like to go and visit them. And Mel has been looking at these sort of, I think she thought it was originally woolen. I think she thought it was Victorian, but now there's a possibility that it's actually Roman in date, and it might be silk. But I won't say too much because that's her work. But we've been looking a little bit at the Amcuts woman. But she's definitely Roman, I think, in terms of judging from the style of the clothing and things like that. And then here we've got the medieval period. And here, this is the period when you're seeing that map that I showed you, the Inglesmore map. So this is, again, control of the wetlands and the rivers is really intensifying during this period. And it's really driving the Fenland economy, I think. And there are nice historical accounts of the Inchmores peat being taken up the Ouse to keep the fires of the Vale of York going. So they're all part of this sort of system of economy, and the rivers are being controlled by monastic houses. So we've got historical accounts about this, and sluices being maintained and so on. So these wetlands are a source of great wealth for monastic houses, but also they're being used by the commoners for grazing and so on. So yeah, I think I mentioned here that the quote of the Thorn boatmen worked their way up the Ouse with turfs to fuel the fires of York. So my sense in all of this, as you look through this long period of time, is that actually there's huge levels of continuity of the usage of these wetland landscapes. And I think it's only really with the drainage of this landscape that it really changes a lot. Yes, there are clearly differences across the different time periods, but there is a sense that this is a very active landscape which is being exploited, but also where people are used to living and have developed their own particular way of living in these places. And really, but the real changing point is the drainage and the post-Reformation improvement of the landscape. And this really changed the whole dynamic. And in that change really was designed to benefit the landowning classes rather than the commoners, who essentially lost major rights to land and common land in that process, and moved us into the current landscape. These are a couple of maps that show you the landscape in the Elizabethan period. This is the Isle of Axholme. It's got all these sort of other rivers that we haven't even been able to track. We just think they're sort of somewhere in here, but they're really difficult to see. They're called skiers, which is quite an unusual name. And then you've got all these drainage systems. You've got the Snow Drain, Old Queen's Drain, Heckdyke. This is the Heckdyke. No, I think that's the Heckdyke coming across here. And then across in some of the maps, you can see these ferries that you had to take a ferry across here and across here. So the Isle was actually isolated for 4 months of the year due to river flooding across all four sides. And even in prehistory, this would have been the case. So the whole way of moving across this landscape would have been very, very different. And here is quite a nice quote from, it's a fictional book called The Manuscript in a Red Box. It's a really good book. It's a completely romanticised view of the drainage. But it really tells this story of conflict, of the drainage of the landscape. And I think it's quite a nice quote here about what this landscape might have looked like just before drainage. So I think sort of to try and sort of wrap up this story, I think we've really got quite a substantially manipulated and engineered river landscape, at least from the Roman period. I think some of the meres might be Roman, or they're certainly medieval. And the archaeological sites are often associated with these river systems. And I think really, as I mentioned, until drainage and reclamation, these places retain a lot of this wilderness character into the post-medieval period, but also places of wealth and activity. And I think they offer a window into a way of life which has completely disappeared from the English and British landscape, but which form part of 25% of the British landscape. I think deserves to be talked about, particularly given the sort of long-term consequences of how landscape and land use has really kind of evolved over this landscape in recent centuries. The other thing about this landscape is that you get these quite interesting cultural practices. So I don't know if anybody's ever visited or been to the Haxey Hood game, or has anybody ever heard the Haxey Hood game? It's a very strange game that is held on 4th of January, where they go round a series of pubs along 3 or 4 villages on the Isle of Axholme, and they play to, the contest is for this hood, which it's like a tug of war exercise. But they also have a fool, and the fool has to be burnt. And the fool was burnt so badly in Victorian times they had to ban it because somebody died, I think. But there's a really weird behaviour. A sort of landscape historian makes the point that he thinks that the Isle of Axholme has actually retained aspects of these cultural practices that go back long periods of time. And you may recall I mentioned the strict cultivation system. Now, one of the aspects of strict cultivation system is it's a much more equitable division of land. It requires cooperative behaviour because each strip of land is not necessarily in ownership for the same individual each year. There may be rotation. And he suggests that perhaps the Haxey Hood game is part of the cultural practices which are allied to that division of the agricultural land, I suppose. And so he suggests that this isolation as a consequence of all the wetlands around this has led to these distinctive cultural behaviours. And I would certainly say that this is a post-colonial landscape that is still very much dealing with post-Reformation legacies and empire, huge social and economic deprivation and huge social inequalities of the haves and the have-nots that I think deserves to be talked about. It's also a landscape which is now under huge threat, and this is what the Respect Project's about. These areas here are all under annual flood level by 2050, and you can see the same thing happening in this area. But the Humber area and Lincolnshire, these produce 12% of England's food production. There are massive land use changes coming online, whether these areas remain under agricultural production, whether they should be there managed for flood alleviation, sea level change, for nature, for culture. These are all issues that are going to be coming up. And that's what the Respect is really trying to start to address, to think about how do you prioritise, how do you give landowners access to information that allows them to make an informed decision around these kind of issues. And thinking about how do we manage these landscapes, their carbon capture, nature conservation. How can we think about the optimal land cover capacity of these landscapes? Currently the UK doesn't have a land use strategy. The document that sets that out has just been published. But on the whole, our land use is very much ad hoc. It's driven by landowners and farmers. But, how do you make these landscapes resilient? So that's what we're trying to look at in the Respect Project. We've got 2 case study areas. The Humber Estuary and the Humber Levels will be one of them. And then the other area is the Firth of Forth, which we've just started working on. We've got to do major restoration of peatland. Most areas of peatland restoration at the moment are happening in uplands, they're not happening in the lowlands, but there are lots of decisions to be made, and we're trying to sort of input to that as part of the Respect Project, really very much directly out of the the Wildscapes project, but this time really trying to make sure we embed the historic environment preservation as part of that decision making rather than as an ad hoc, post hoc type of thing. And the work we've been doing has already started to feed into other areas. So this is a case study example that was published by Historic England recently. And interestingly, and I hadn't even thought about this, of course, a lot of our maps are actually showing flood risk maps as well. We've just been mapping them for their peat, but there's lots of sort of value added, I think, in this type of work. I've mentioned already the MSA work. This is the quantified outputs that we can get, and thinking through, which one of these scenarios is going to be the most resilient. Maybe none of them, but it's about sort of thinking through how we can use the archaeological record to think about the future, I suppose. And I think the last thing I would say is that a lot of our environmental issues, I think, have really come down to lack of connection between people and place and people and nature and culture embedded into that. And I think archaeology is a wonderful vehicle to allow that to happen. It allows us to tell those stories that sometimes can be quite difficult to tell. I've certainly tried to talk to members of the public about climate change and being given a real grilling, actually. But if you try and do it through archaeology, it can open up new conversations. And I think, but it does, and it gives you this opportunity to reconnect and have these conversations with people. But it also needs to be part of a two-way conversation. And I suppose archaeology gives you that opportunity. But also, to be effective, I think it does also need to address some of these issues about, you know, human inequalities. And environmentalists are sort of arguing that really in order for us to think about environmental protection, we also have to address where those issues may be. And I think what's happened in the Humberhead Levels is part of that conversation. I think it deserves to be told. I think I will leave it there because I've gone on too long. Sorry.